Okay, then we're on. Hi, my name is Runhild Seim, and I would like to welcome you to our first event here at the library stage since March. Yay! We are thrilled to host the book launch of Atle Libæk Wold's new book, Privateering and Diplomacy 1793 to 1807, Great Britain, Denmark-Norway and the Question of Neutral Ports, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Atle is Associate Professor at the Department of Literature, Area Studies and European Languages here at the University of Oslo. He is a historian by training, and most of his research has been on 18th century British history, with a main focus on Scotland in the 1790s. In more recent years, he has taken an interest in privateering in the late 18th and early 19th century. Welcome, Atle. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those who turned up on this rather grey day, and also thank you for those who might be watching from other places. Okay, so Privateering and Diplomacy was not really a title that I had to compete for. No one else has used it before. But why this particular combination? Why privateering and diplomacy? That's really at the center of the theme I'm addressing in the book, which I'll be talking about in a minute, both privateering and diplomacy. Where did this come from? Well, this book is the end product of, if you like, of a project that I've been working on for a number of years, and which began with the chance discovery of a primary source in the National Library of Scotland. So in some ways, it's perhaps as far away from project-initiated research that you could possibly get. This was something I stumbled across by chance. I was sitting in the manuscript reading room in the National Library of Scotland, shifting through the pages of the Caledonian Mercury, and now you realize that this was quite a while ago because it was before the Mercury had been digitalized, as most British newspapers have been now. And I was looking through the year 1799, and in the edition for the 22nd of July, I stumbled across something rather interesting. Here's the page of the Caledonian Mercury. As you can see, this is all very clear, rather small. As most newspapers at the time, it was essentially just one large sheet of paper that had been folded once, and so you had 4 pages, and the cost of paper was quite high due to the stamp duty on it, so you better cram in as much text as you possibly could. Under the editorial section, which is the column that starts sort of here, Caledonian Mercury, and down this way, down here was an article that caught my attention, and it was not related to what I was working with at the time. And I suppose this is an example of the advantage you have by looking manually through a document. It takes a lot of time, but sometimes you find something it's unlikely you would have found if you were doing a digital search, because it wasn't related to what I was working on at the time. Well, what did this exciting primary source say? I'm building it up now. Well, it was the heading of Dundee, 19th July. So news from the town on Dundee, north of Edinburgh. Caledonian Mercury was an Edinburgh-based newspaper. And it said, "This morning brought intelligence of the capture of the Tay Greenland man, a full ship off Kinnaird Head, 16 days ago by a privateer of 16 guns, which carried her into Bergen. The crew were landed at Aberdeen, yesterday from Norway. The ship and cargo are valued at upwards of £6,000 and will be a heavy blow to this place." Fair enough, but then came the crucial point. "It is to be hoped that government will at last take some effectual measures to have this nest of pirates and robbers rooted out, which for so long has been allowed to insult our country and injure our trade." Now, apart from the image of Bergen as a nest of pirates and robbers that kind of lingered with me for a bit, what struck me about this passage was the timing. Because 1799, well, at this point, the dual monarchy of Denmark-Norway was neutral in the war between Britain and France. So how could it be that a neutral country, and in this case, what is often referred to as a third-rate power, such as Denmark-Norway, seemed to be aiding one of the belligerents, as the article suggested? Were the people of Bergen, as well as the Danish government, not afraid of British reprisals? You are potentially antagonizing the greatest naval power at the time. And this is a seafaring nation. We, particularly Norway, depended on trade. So why are they doing this? That struck me as rather odd and worth looking into, I thought. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that it was quite a big issue, quite a major concern. In the diplomatic correspondence for Denmark-Norway, which is reports from British diplomats back to London, this takes up about half the amount of material, this particular issue. So it was of great concern at the time. Okay, so privateering and diplomacy. I don't know about you whether privateering is something you immediately sort of recognize, and yes, I know what that is. I was familiar about it at the time because I was looking at Scotland and there was great concern about French privateers in Scotland, but let's sort of look at what this means, and that's quite central to the issue, of course. First and foremost, a privateer looks quite similar to a pirate. It's, to some extent, it seems the same kind of activity, but it's not the same. Okay, crucial point. Privateering can be described as a form of commercial warfare conducted by private entrepreneurs, but sanctioned by the state. And that means it's legal. And by the late 18th century, most states in Europe accepted privateering as a legal and acceptable form of warfare. Piracy, by contrast, was perceived as illegal by most states at this point and as a serious form of crime. So you have one legal institution, another very much illegal one, but they look the same. That's potentially problematic. So how to distinguish between the two? And this is quite important at the time, and a lot of time and effort had really been put into making sure that you had this clear distinction. Now, as I indicated here with commercial warfare, privateering was linked to war. Yeah, so privateers would be sent out at a time of war, not in peacetime. But more importantly, perhaps, and of course only belligerents could indulge in privateering, not neutral countries. That was not accepted by the later 18th century. To make sure that it was different from piracy, it was organized in a certain way, and this organization was important. And it centered on the issuing of so-called letters of marque and on price courts. Now, what would happen when there was an outbreak of war was that the state in one of the belligerent countries, or perhaps both of them, would issue these letters of marque, which were permissions given to private entrepreneurs to hire a crew and equip ships with weapons, guns, cannon, so that these ships could be sent out and hunt for the enemy's merchant vessels. And if a merchant vessel was caught out at sea, they could bring it back to the home port. And this is important. It should come back to the home port, where a case would be raised before a so-called price court to adjudicate whether it was a legal price. Now, was this actually an enemy ship and not a neutral one, for example? And this arrangement was crucial to make sure that privateering didn't descend into piracy. Privateering was also a high-risk venture, very hazardous. If you were successful, profits could be phenomenal. But if your ship was caught by the enemy's navy, you lost the ship, the crew went into imprisonment, and suddenly you've lost a lot of money. Yeah, so as a private venture, this is very risky, but tempting because the profits could be fantastic if you were lucky. Some even thought there was an open invitation to abuse because of this. Because the captains of privateer vessels, keen to get a catch, until they've caught a ship, this is a loss-making venture. They're out at sea, they have provisions and so on. All of this has to be paid for. And so they would be quite keen to actually make some gains and therefore push the limits quite often. One example from the year 1797, for example, was when the Danish vessel, the Norge, was captured and brought back to Nantes by a French privateer on the grounds that the captain's sea pass was invalid and that the crew list lacked the signature of a Danish official. That was not sufficient, according to any rules really, for saying that the vessel was sailing in support of the British war effort, and it should have been dismissed, but it was nevertheless deemed a legal price by the price court in Nantes, And the reason there may have been that most of the judges on the prize court had actually invested in privateering themselves. So while privateering looked fine on paper, in practice it seemed to create all sorts of problems, and for that reason I think it's fair to say that there was a growing discontent with the system in many places, certainly in Britain, by the later 18th century. For many people, privateering looked like a sort of relic of the past, an example of the kind of privatized warfare the 18th century had left behind or moved away from. Just a little sort of interesting example I came across, when privateering was finally largely abolished in 50 years later, or more than 50 years later, in 1854, the British newspaper, the Daily News, stated that a privateer was, quote, merely a pirate with a pardon in his pocket. Many would have subscribed to that view already in the 1790s. Now, the French were particularly keen on privateering, and as I said, normally privateers would operate out of a home port. So why would French privateers wish to use ports in Norway, which this use of Bergen seemed to suggest? Well, first of all, there were a couple of dominant privateer ports in France. It wasn't the same all over the place. Dunkirk, Nantes, and Saint-Malo, which isn't on this particular map. And if you were, there was British trade you could attack in many places, but of particular interest was the Baltic Sea trade. That was very valuable, and there were many ships. You could, of course, try to attack the ships as they were leaving port in the UK, Britain at this point, it's not UK yet. London, for example, but that would be very dangerous. You've got the Royal Navy around there, and typically privateers stood little chance to defend themselves against naval vessels. So better would be to linger somewhere around here and try and capture the ships as they were coming through the Sound. Quite often they were hunting in the Kattegat and also in the Skagerrak area. If you captured a ship here, you would still need to travel all the way back, and in the case of Nantes, through the English Channel and down here. That's a long journey with great chance of being caught on the way. So, for that reason, it was quite interesting to, well, stay around Norway. Using Norwegian ports, what if the privateers, rather than traveling back and forth to their home port in France, try to operate out of the ports of a neutral country? Well, clearly that would be outside of the norm as it had been established for privateering and unusual, but was it therefore unacceptable or illegal necessarily? It was acceptable for the ships of warring nations to travel in neutral waters. Could you go into port and stay there for a bit and get replenishments? Typically, it was allowed for anyone to go into port out of necessity. If you had gone into a storm, you lost sails, and you were generally the ship was in poor repair. The accepted rule was that you could go into a neutral port for safety reasons, essentially. But could you operate out of these ports? This was outside the norm, and for that reason, there wasn't really very much in terms of legal material to resort to either. Bilateral treatises didn't particularly mention this. Legal scholars had not addressed it. There wasn't much about it in international law, what was at the time called the law of nations. It was extremely difficult to pin down whether this was illegal or not. The British tried, and they struggled to actually find something they could stop this on. And why Norwegian ports in particular? Why was this particularly attractive? Well, in the words of John Mitchell, the British consul at Kristiansand and Christiania, he had quite a broad remit, I think, for his actions. The most central figure in my book, actually, and arguably the most central figure in this whole scenario. Well, according to him, at one point he stated to his superior in Copenhagen that the southern coast of Norway was bold and safe and full of good harbors and furnished with good pilots, whereas the Jutland shores were low and surrounded with dangerous shoals. So, merchant vessels tried to stay as close to the coast of Norway as they could on their way to the Baltic. They would typically, when sailing, come in around either the Naze, Lindesnes, or Mandal, the southern tip, and then follow the coast as much as they could on the way down to avoid going closer to Denmark. Sailing all the way along here. And the same on the return leg, up here, down, and then head across the North Sea. But the cragged Norwegian coastline with lots of rocks and small islands was also, of course, a superb place to hide away with a privateering vessel. And so the privateers would also position themselves along the coastline here, laying waiting to see when the merchant vessels were passing by and then try to attack them. So there was clearly an advantage in terms of using the Norwegian coast as a form of base, going into the ports there for supplies, for example, and then use outports and other places along the coast as a sort of base for spotting merchant ships and then attacking them, rather than travel back and forth to France. However, if ships the privateers had captured, travel back and forth to France, but could they dispose of ships in these ports? The general rule is that you need to bring them back to port. What if you instead could bring your ships into port in Norway and sell them there, both cargo and shipped, rather than going all the way back to France? Then you would not need to hazard the long travel through the English Channel. So this was also very tempting to privateers to try and make sure that they could dispose of them in Norwegian ports. And what was clear in 1793 was that there was a precedence for this. Such activities, i.e. the sale of cargoes and vessels in Norwegian ports, had taken place in previous wars, all from the 17th century onwards, with the approval of the French and Danish authorities. Usually, the adjudication of captures, which would normally have been done by a prize court, was then carried out by the French consuls in Norway instead. The British side were fully aware of this precedent and determined to prevent a repetition. We do not want this to go on again. Again, John Mitchell was quite central in notifying the British government, okay, this is going to happen now. We need to address the problem. They weren't entirely successful at this, it must be said, but this was where diplomacy came into it. Because the British approach was primarily one of trying to stop the phenomenon of French privateers operating out of Norwegian ports by means of persuasion, by argument with the Danish government. And so a debate was initiated, and it was carried out by the British diplomatic representative at Copenhagen. This was in line with British policies at the time, which was that one would prefer to raise discussions with other powers through the representative in the capital of that power, rather than raise it with, say, the Danish ambassador in London. That increased the possibility of someone intercepting the communications, so a lot of it was actually carried out in cipher. It was, and so on, but one preferred to do it that way. So most of the discussions that go on with this is the British representative raising the issue with the Danish central minister at the time, which was Bernstoff, trying to bring it to an end. There were many issues at stake in this. The first attempt the British made was essentially just to make the Danish side accept that, well, you haven't yet accepted the new French Republican regime. Well, then you cannot accept their privateers into your ports. To which the Danes replied, well, you are fighting a war with them, and you're treating prisoners as prisoners of war, not criminals, so clearly you have accepted. And Bernstoff, quite interesting, I think is quite a striking phrase, just said about France, well, the nation exists, we have to relate to it. And so far they've been honoring all treaties they have with us, so we have no problem with them, really. The main concern, of course, was neutrality. And neutrality, this is quite interesting, had not been sort of fully defined yet by the late 18th century. There were different schools debating quite fiercely what neutrality really meant. But one had agreed on some things, and a central aspect of it was that neutrality, to a large extent, could be defined by two duties, two principles. The first one was the duty of abstention. In order to claim neutrality, you had to abstain from involvement in the military conflict. Abstention was about what neutrals could not do, full stop. For example, support one of the two sides militarily. This was perhaps the stronger duty and the clearest one. The other was impartiality, which really referred to what neutrals could do as long as it was done without giving undue preference to one of the belligerents. Also relatively clear on paper, but much more difficult in practice. How could this be related to privateering in neutral ports? Well, to give you one example from the long-lasting debates they had, the Danish government tried to argue that as long as it gave the privateers of all belligerent countries equal access to its ports, then it was honouring its neutrality because it was acting in an impartial manner. It was not giving undue preference to one or the other side. They could both British privateers could also come into Norwegian ports. Fine, you're welcome. So we are being impartial and we're neutral. To this, the British side responded that, in theory, yes, but since there were typically around 4,000 British merchant vessels passing through the Sound every year, that's usually a bit more than a third of the total, compared to always well below 100 French, and usually around 20. Well, in real terms, the Danish side was giving an advantage to the French because there wasn't much use for British privateers to operate in these waters anyway. There wasn't anything to hunt for. So in that sense, this was an undue preference given to the French side by the Danes. And so the arguments went on, and it became complicated and difficult. Although the British side was able to gain some concessions from the Danish government early on in 1793, and it was mainly that if French privateers brought captured ships into Norwegian ports, they could only sell the cargo if it was perishable, essentially foodstuffs. This wasn't adhered to at all, but that was sort of an agreement of a sort which the British side sort of grudgingly accepted. But they were not able to persuade the Danes to close the ports fully. They were, however, able to stay remarkably well informed about what happened in Norway. And that's related to the diplomatic aspect of this diplomacy, but even more so to do with the consuls. I already mentioned the French consuls had a role, and John Mitchell, of course. The groundwork was carried out by the British consuls. By the 1793, Denmark-Norway had a relatively larger number of British consuls than most other countries that Britain sent consuls to. And a consul, by the way, the primary task of a consul is to look after the interests of trading people from his own country overseas. So he's stationed typically in a port in a foreign country where he's going to look after the interests of merchants from his own country. That's the main function. There was one consul at Elsinore whose task was to oversee what happened in the Sound, where the ships were passing through. So one in Denmark. There was typically one in Kristiansand, one in Norway, one in Bergen, one in Trondheim, and then a couple of vice-consuls, one in Stavanger and another in Kristian, and so on, which meant that Denmark-Norway had more British consuls than the US, for example. There were only 3 British consuls for the whole of the US. This apparatus of men on the ground, if you like, meant that the diplomatic service had eyes and ears out there. That's the function of the consuls. They can procure intelligence for the diplomatic service. And John Mitchell stood forward with a particularly interesting venture here. Now, again, there wasn't much to say what a consul should do when in a neutral country, when his own country was at war. This was a new situation. This about privateers coming into ports in a neutral country. What should the consul do then, if anything, was unclear. But Mitchell was very energetic and set about devising his own intelligence system with informants pitted along the southern coast of Norway, which he paid to work in the interest of Britain. I've got a map created on this where I've plotted in all his informants, and as you can see, he's got informants along the whole of the southern Norwegian coast here, in all sorts of small places and harbours and outports along the coast. People working for the British government, being paid by the British consul to procure intelligence. The French did similar things, by the way. So you have Norwegians working for either side in the conflict. Now, how that squares with neutrality is, of course, also interesting. But this meant that the British government was often better informed than Copenhagen. And all this information procured by the consuls could also be used by the Royal Navy when hunting for privateers. Okay. In 1799, the ports were finally closed to privateers. Why? And would it hold up? Well, those are issues I explore in the book, and I'm not going to spill the beans on that now. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Atle, for a very engaging and interesting presentation. I was wondering if there were any questions from the audience. Maybe where can I buy your book?
Yeah.
You have a question?
Just a small question. I was just intrigued by who bought the cargo in Bergen. Now you said that only perishable goods were allowed to be sold, but it said that the value of the ship was about £6,000, which is a lot of money. But does that mean that only the perishables
No.
would be? Nah. So, is there any way of knowing?
Yeah, I haven't been able to map, the entire picture here. But what I found was that a newspaper, which Mitchell referred to as the Kristiansand Weekly Gazette, Kristiansands Adressekontors Efterretninger, as is the name, published auctions, notifications of auctions where one would sell goods. Well, and this is the point. It's not just perishable goods, it's any goods held on board the ship, including at one point I found muskets and weaponry even. They're also selling the inventory of the ship, so stripping it of anything valuable inside that you could flog off, and they're selling the ships. And this was not according to the agreement of 1793, and they're selling everything. I mean, I've found a few examples where a new auction is held in order to sell the remains from a previous one, which seems to suggest that usually they sold everything. There's a big market for it. And it's advertised not just in Norway, but also in the German duchies. So in Altona, for example, there will be advertisements for auctions coming up in Norway. So judging from that particular material, which doesn't cover the whole of the Norwegian coast, there was quite a, shall we say, an energetic business going on here.
Are there any other questions? In that case, maybe you have some closing remarks, Atle?
Yeah, there's one thing I didn't really mention here, is that working with this, this project had two aspects. One is the more general theme, which I've talked about here, but another is to look at individual cases and what goes on. So that's one I also address, and there are some quite remarkable individual cases here, and all the problems that crop up when British naval ships and French privateers are fighting it out just outside a Norwegian port, and you have cannon shot whizzing past the windows of residential houses, which wasn't particularly popular, to put it that way. So there are two elements in this book in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was great to have an event here at the library again.
Yes.
You were the first. Thank you so much, and welcome back another time.
Thanks.